Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and today I'm very pleased and honored to have with us as a guest David Schultz. Dr. Schultz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Just a little intro. Dr. Schultz, you're a professor, so do you prefer doctor or professor?
I prefer professor. I never use the title doctor.
Okay, but Professor Schultz, in addition to a PhD, you have a law degree, and you've taught at numerous universities, including UW River Falls.
Correct, yeah, I taught there for several years.
And you've been the author of 25 books, 12 legal treatises, over 90 articles, and one of which happened to be a commentary that you did on It's the Swing States, Stupid, and that was back in March of 2012, is that right?
Yeah, it's an article I did for Politics in Minnesota.
All right. And I remember when you came to Hudson a while back and spoke, I think it was to our high school seniors that were getting honors, and that was a fascinating talk. But anyway, with your background as a Fulbright scholar and also work in foreign countries in the U.S. State Department as a political scientist, you are quite involved in the elections, and we've seen you on some of the local network television, and you were up late the other night with the election.
I was at KARE 11 till about 2:30, then managed to get an hour's worth of sleep and got up and started talking about the elections again early in the morning. It was a good show. We had former Congressman Gil Gutnick, who represents Republican from southern part of Minnesota, and then Jim Oberstar, who was up in the Iron Range area, Duluth, and then John Kriesel, a current Republican legislator. So we had a really nice kind of a panel. I learned a lot from them because they're legislators. I mean, they know a part of politics that I don't know anything about.
Well, as a former political science major, I'm fascinated with politics and also a former candidate myself. But let's just dissect the election a little bit and use our time wisely, and hopefully you'll come back again as a guest. But first, let's start with, you wrote this article about the swing states, and at that time you listed 14, and I noted that Minnesota's not on there.
Yeah.
So why is Minnesota not considered one of the swing states, in your opinion?
Well, not considered a swing state, mostly for the fact that definition of a swing state would be a state that has, let's say, over the last 2 or 3 presidential elections, has flipped back and forth, between supporting, a Republican or a Democrat. And Minnesota has been firmly in the Democratic camp, at the presidential level, since 1972. It's gotten pretty consistent at that point. And while below the presidential level, we've elected, Republican, Democratic governors, Republican, Democratic senators, congresspeople, and so forth. But at the presidential level, it seems to have been pretty solid Democrat, not like in New York or California, which is overwhelming, but for the most part, about 4, 5, 6, 7 points in terms of Democrats.
Okay, and I was going to mention that you listed 14. We all know, people that were watching the TV, that there were about 8 states.
Right.
Iowa, Wisconsin, Virginia, Florida,
Ohio,
etc.
sure.
Ohio, definitely Ohio. 8 states that stayed in the gray. They were not committed blue or red until relatively later, before the full call. And so, rather than that full 14, now, what takes a swing state and puts it into a direction that then takes it more or less out of play, where and until like 2 days before the election, Romney went to Pennsylvania, for instance, but yet before that it had not been really considered one that was within the margin of error.
Sure, okay. I think what puts them in play or not puts them in play is a bunch of factors, of course. I had 14 on that list originally. Eventually, I worked it down to about 10 states. And just sort of tell you, so for a long time, I kept telling people that in those 10 swing states, about 10% of the population was undecided. Because about 6 months ago, we had in states like Ohio and Florida, it was about 45, 44, 46, approximately for the 2 candidates, with about 10% undecided. And so the way I describe the race is that 10% of the population in 10 swing states would decide who gets to 270, that is, the 270 electoral votes. Right. And in those swing states, the most critical swing voters were what we would call, the suburban soccer moms. They were also working class whites, clearly hit hard, by the economic recession, and then young people. And I say young people as swing voters because even though they usually vote overwhelmingly Democratic, they usually don't vote, So those were our 3 groups. So, soccer moms, working class whites, and students. And what was happening over several months is some states seem to, because of their particular mix of economics, because of the employment structure, seem to move in or out of sort of a swing state category. And so, for example, Michigan, which early on was considered to be a swing state, moved out of the swing state, partly because of the way that the auto industry was helped by Barack Obama. Mitt Romney basically decided at some point that there's no point campaigning in there. So it was a combination of some early signs saying that the economy and the economic factors were pushing politics in a particular way, candidates making a conscious choice not to compete in a state, all led to it not being a swing state in terms of, again, the polls would help in this terms of it also too. And so you're right, early in about mid-September, Romney stopped campaigning in Pennsylvania and gave up on Michigan. And so put no resources in those states. And it wasn't until about the last 10 days of the campaign that he started putting more money into Pennsylvania. And he had to do that for a couple of reasons. One is because the polls were saying he's not doing well in Ohio, wasn't closing the gap. And if he didn't win Ohio, he couldn't win the presidency. So if he can't win Ohio, or he could, but it would have been very difficult. So he has to figure out, if he can't win Ohio, what does he have to do? He's got to now start to compete in states like Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and others, and hope to be able to tip those states. And so that's why he started campaigning in them in those last 10 days.
Okay, and that would be one of the effects of polling. And I want to talk about, the impact of polling and how it's used this year because of, the internet and the advances there, and polling is done mostly by telephone. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have gotten rid of landlines, and so there's a lot of analysis in there.
Right.
But yet, the polls tend to be incredibly accurate. And some of the polls had a 2.5%, 2.5% plus or minus margin. There are others that were up to 4%, and yet we'd see polls released on the same day, covering the same dates, and they could be as different as up to 5% apiece. And there's the website I'm sure you're familiar with that Nate Silver had on
538.
538. And he was keeping track of all this, and he was weighting the polls, whereas Real Clear Politics, RCP, was taking just averages and showing that basically a deadlock tied race, which was pretty close to being on the popular part, but he named his website 538 because of the number of electoral votes.
Right.
And so how is it that Silver was able to be so successful? And I have to throw you in there, as in addition to some of those people who predicted the race, you were right, and I guess Karl Rove was wrong. And Signal.com was another one that claims to have called it back in February for a 300 vote, up to a 300 vote electoral win.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. First off, let's think about the dynamics of this race. If you go back to about February of this year, that the polls in about February were saying that Obama and Romney were more or less tied. And except for a small period between the Democratic National Convention and right after the first debate that the two candidates had, the polling was incredibly stable. Right after the Democratic National Convention, Obama opened up a slight but solid lead, and then lost that after the first debate. And we all remember the first debate, which was probably the worst performance for any debater I've ever seen, and most of us would agree. So except for that 1 month of volatility, it was pretty close, with Obama generally enjoying about a 1 or so point lead in the national polls. And that becomes important because that's essentially where the campaign ended on Tuesday, in the sense that Obama had a very slight lead. But what Obama always had was in those critical swing states, he seemed to have a very slight lead there. And what Obama did and what Nate Silver did in 538 was to try to understand what's happening at that subnational level, at that state level, in terms of the polling. Now,
getting back to the swing states that was in your article.
Exactly, that's right. And so the focus was on that, and never really on the national numbers. Now, Nate's way of trying to weigh the polls was a combination of what the polls were saying, but also looking at past performance in terms of polls in particular states, as well as some good guesses that he made. He's developed a good track record in terms of putting it all together. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that I remember on election night a couple of nights ago, it was right a couple minutes after the polls closed in Wisconsin. You might recall the national networks are calling Wisconsin. Even though the big board is saying
Romney was ahead.
Romney was ahead by 8 or 9 points or something, they're declaring that Obama's won the state, that Tammy Baldwin has won the senatorship. And I remember people being upset and saying, how could this be the case? And I said, well, they're using very good exit polling in terms of what they're looking at is critical precincts across the state of Wisconsin, voting behavior there, and based upon past performance can make some pretty good projections. And one of the things that I think what was so interesting about this election is that the Democrats, I think, and Obama especially, I should say exclusively, did a better job with what I call data-driven politics, that they were looking at really hard numbers, really looking at sort of past behaviors in precincts around the country to be able to figure out where they're ahead, where they're behind, where they need to get voters. And so they took something that Karl Rove originally started in 2004, which was this micro-targeting, merging politics and marketing data. And Obama just simply took everything that Karl Rove had taught people and just did it way better. And I found it fascinating, on election night where Karl Rove goes into a fit, at Fox News when they call the race also in Ohio. And remember, there's a great scene where Megyn Kelly runs off to, interrogate their statisticians.
They went right to the decision room.
Right to the decision room. And they stood behind what they did. And so what was interesting here is just simply how the Democrats just worked with the data better this time than did the Republicans. And if you looked on election night, we always remember mistakes. We always remember when the networks call it for Al Gore in Florida.
Well, that's what I was going to say. They got it wrong in 2000.
They got it wrong, and we always remember the
exit polls were wrong
right.
And
we'll explain why the exit polls are wrong. We'll explain why some polls can get it wrong. But the point I was going to get at is this time they mostly got it right. Okay. Now a couple of things to think about in terms of exit polling and then polling in general. There's pretty good evidence that in 2004, John Kerry won the election on election day, but didn't win the election. And why? We knew back in 2004, about 25% of the American public voted in the elections before Election Day, approximately, give or take a couple of points. And so exit polls are going to miss all those early voters. And so George Bush did a phenomenal job before the election, racking up large support for himself. And thus, whatever numbers came in on exit poll day, well, that didn't give us the full picture.
And that happened this time, though, for Obama.
It happened this time for Obama also, exactly, because the estimates are that about 35 to 40%, and we'll find out soon, 35 to 40% voted in advance of Election Day. I heard a statistic that said that 2 million people voted in advance in Colorado. So that's going to clearly, it's going to mess up exit polling. So the exit polling isn't as accurate as it could be because of that. And so pollsters got to figure out how to weigh early voting in. But the other problem that you hit at in terms of polling is there's two things that I look for in all polls. One is the mix of Democrats versus Republicans. And some of those polls, like listed on Real Clear Politics, I looked at them and I said, that's not the mix of what I think is the number of Democrats versus Republicans. And then the second thing is the cell phone landline issue. And the best evidence now from the people and I get this information from the cell phone industry, so I assume they know what they're talking about. And they say that we're now at about 37 to 38% of the population that is cell phone exclusive. Well, and so right off the bat, any mix then tells me you've got to have roughly 60-40 landline cell phone in order to be accurate. And then some polls, to try to save money, do robo-polling with computers. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get a call and it's a computer on the other end, I know what I do. I hang it right up. And so you have to wonder how accurate robocall polls are that are using computers.
Okay, so that's going to affect the polling. Now, with exit polling, early voting,
right.
I want to know, what's the impact of momentum? Because wasn't Kerry gaining on Bush? And so was it because so many voted early and Bush had those locked up, then it didn't matter?
Exactly.
But here, which way was the momentum going? Because it wasn't clear whether the early voting was going to hurt Obama or help him. Of course, we found out after the election it ended up helping him.
That's right, right. And that's exactly what turned out happening in the case, is that he got his people to the polls very early and locked them down. And with the exception of Minnesota, where if you do absentee voting, you can change your vote. But every other state, once you've committed your vote, it's over at that point. And so he did a very good job in terms of getting people out to vote early, nailed them down so he didn't have to worry about them, and then he could concentrate on those undecided voters in terms of targeting to them. Whereas what Romney didn't do was either nail down those voters early, and so he had to still worry about making sure I got him in the flock, get him to vote, and then also try to switch the minds or make up the minds of the swing voters. That's a lot of work to do. And so if you've already got, and think about it, if you've already got the sale made, great, go on to the next sale. Whereas Romney's still trying to seal the deal on one and try to make the next sale at the same time.
I have in-laws that live in Minnesota, so that's only anecdotal. I can talk to them. But how are political scientists analyzing the impact of the swing state mentality on the voters themselves? Because here in Wisconsin, being a swing state, we get to feel really important. Yeah. Unfortunately, it means all of the commercials are political for the solid 6 weeks before the election. But if the race goes down to now 7 or 8 states, what are the other 42 states doing? I've got a brother that lives out in Washington, for instance, and he is very frustrated with the fact that he wanted to cast his vote for Romney, but he felt like it didn't matter because they had already called the race for Obama in Washington. Yeah,
that's true. And about, for the most part, and for the last, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks of the election, maybe almost from September, almost from Labor Day on, if you lived in 40 states, you almost didn't matter. A Republican living in Texas, a Republican wanting to vote for Romney in New York, it almost didn't matter. A Democrat wanting to vote for Obama in Texas, it almost didn't matter. So you're right, in about 40 states, it didn't matter because of the way our electoral college is set up at this point. And it does become very frustrating. And so in a state like Wisconsin, where, again, you're a swing state, maybe we all got frustrated with the amount of political commercials, but on the other hand, people were constantly reminded, it's election day, and it really does have an impact.
Okay, when you say it has an impact, has that borne out in comparing registered voters to actual voters in these states that it doesn't matter? For instance, Wyoming, where it's 72% Romney, or Idaho or Utah. Is the turnout lower in those states where no campaign activity is
going on? Yes, it actually is. You have to hold constant for a few other variables, of course, and we have to hold constant for a couple other things, that might not be going on. But in general, where swing states do exhibit, on balance, higher voter turnout. Now, Minnesota is not a swing state, but again, it has the highest voter turnout in the country for other reasons. Like Wisconsin has day of election registration. It has both the states share similar cultures, civic cultures that encourage people to participate in politics. But sort of bracketing those off to the side, for the most part, swing states generally do better in terms of encouraging people to vote because people feel like, well, gosh, my vote actually matters, and it's worth for me voting.
Have we seen an outcome change or get a lot closer because of lower turnout? Have we seen a state that was thought to be solidly either one way, they're red or blue, and then end up more pinkish or gray, if you will?
That's a good question here. Because clearly we have, for example, indications that some states, especially in the South, for example, where we have low voter registration for comparatively for Hispanics and blacks, that in some of those states, were there higher registrations, they would be maybe perhaps more competitive. But you phrase the question in a way that's good in the sense that we can't point to sort of any firm thing that says that lower turnout is leading to less competitiveness. Lower turnout may change the results, in terms of saying that Democrat versus Republican wins, but I'm not sure it really affects competitiveness.
And maybe it's it doesn't matter question,
right?
Because in the end, with the polling that we have now, any state that was not a swing state, for instance, Georgia, in 2008, prior to 2008, no one would have thought that was a swing state, solid Republican. All of a sudden, Obama does very well there.
Yeah.
So the impact of polling and knowing that it's going to be close in Florida, for instance, they still don't know who won Florida.
That's right. It's good. this is one of our fears was for a lot of us that if it all came down to Florida, we're going to be sitting and waiting for Florida. And I don't know about you, is that I'm just glad the result was definitive, in terms of Tuesday. Because if it did come down to Florida again, it's not clear when they're going to be done, because they've got lots of ballots to count. And I also thought it was just nuts on Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning, where finally sometime around 1 in the morning in Florida, they said, we're tired, we're going to go home, and we're going to count them later. It's like, no, you're supposed to count the ballots now.
And while you say the result was definitive, a couple things on that. One is we have an extremely split electorate.
We do.
And two is, will we ever see a Nixon-McGovern landslide again from 72? Or because of this polling and the swing state stuff, is it always going to be 300, 200, or close to 270?
Yeah, we're looking at least for the foreseeable future, it probably being, something along this line, very close. We have a political divide in this country that is overlaid by our geography. People now seem to sort themselves out, not just in terms of where the good schools are, but in terms of what's the political landscape of the neighborhood. And so not only nationwide do we have this kind of political geography, but within parts of states. Wisconsin has this, Minnesota has this. And in the Minnesota legislature, 201 seats, we probably only have about 30 seats that are truly competitive. And in the state of Wisconsin, I taught at UW River Falls, I remember this, we probably only have maybe 15, 20 seats between the Assembly and Senate that are truly swing.
Out of 132.
132, yeah. So you're looking at, what's my number there? We're looking at, again, maybe 25% out of that whole mix, maybe a little bit higher, but roughly, we know for the vast majority of solid Republican districts, solid Democratic district, everything gets fought over a very small number. I mean, to show the stakes, a few years ago, Sheila Harsdorf, not only with the recall that she faced, earlier this year, but a few years ago, she faced an incredibly intense re-election, I think about a decade ago, which actually cost, I think, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars.
The Alice Clausing.
The Alice Clausing, exactly. I mean, incredibly high stakes race, because that was the battle for the Senate, because the Senate was just like, literally a vote.
16, 17.
Something like that. And so take a very competitive race like that, and this is a swing district over here, and that thus one of the few that's really going to determine the balance of power in the state of
Just like the $6 billion that was spent on elections this year, almost half of which was just the presidential alone because of the outside money. When you start thinking about, they said like $26 per vote.
Right.
But if you broke it down to just the swing states, then the cost goes even higher.
Right. Well, if we break it down even more, I did a piece. This was the piece that I did, several months ago. But in about the last week before the election, I broke it down even further and said, it's probably not 10% of the population in 10 states. I said it's probably 5% of the population in about 7 states. And I did some math and calculated it out and said it was about 1.5 million people across the United States, across those 7 swing states that would determine the election. And so if you put it in that perspective, let's say $4 billion to move about, let's say 1.5 million people, my joke was it would have been cheaper to take everybody out for dinner and a movie than it would be to do all that advertising. Right. But that's how small it came down. And then even better, I did, and I'm not the only person to say this, is that, for example, in Ohio, the whole focus in Ohio was on Hamilton County. That's where Cincinnati is. And whoever won Hamilton, Ohio, was going to win the presidency, because whoever won Hamilton won Ohio. Whoever wins Ohio wins the presidency. The networks keyed in on Hamilton County, Ohio, and it's exactly what happened. Obama won it. But in all the swing states, I had put together a list at one point and said, here's about 11 counties in these 7 swing states that truly matter. And one of my students this morning came into class and said, well, guess what? I said, what? And he goes, Obama won 10 of those 11 counties in those swing states. And I said, that tells you why he won. That's how small our geography is now, that we're just talking about counties within states.
And you're talking about a 5% swing, which in the polling, that's a plus or minus 2.5%.
That's right. That's right.
And so wasn't Obama's average in those swing states like 53%, and he ended up winning 52% of the whole country overall, so
that's
very
right.
close.
It was very close. Actually, it was even less than that. I think in the end, he was closer to about 51%. And so a very, very narrow victory for him. not a blowout.
But a little bit larger margin in the swing states.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes, in the swing states, yes, he certainly did better there. And he did better there because, again, he really worked those swing states in terms of concentrating on them.
Okay. Switching the topic a little bit to everyone does the soul searching and the postmortems on, the Republicans are saying, why did we lose? And some are blaming the candidate, others are blaming the message and the platform of the party as being antiquated, maybe still fighting the cultural wars of the 80s and so forth. So with your analysis, what would you be letting the Republicans know they need to do going forward? Is it come up with a more conservative candidate? Because that's what a lot of people are blaming Romney, because he was too moderate.
Right. Well, first off, this was an election that Obama should have never won. That with the unemployment rate that was 7.88%. He should have never won. The second thing that I think Romney did exceedingly well was to focus on Obama's failure to have a good narrative or explanation for why he deserved 4 more years.
Or what he's even going to do in the second term.
Exactly. That's exactly. And Obama still has not given us that answer. And so Romney had advantages going for him. And I think people are going to see or draw 2 lessons from all of this. One is going to be some of the Republicans will say he was not conservative enough. The Tea Party people, the Rick Santorums of the party, the Paul Ryans are going to say he needed to be more conservative. Whereas I think there might be equally a compelling argument to say that had Mitt Romney run as what he used to be, a moderate, business-oriented Republican from the East, who didn't want to talk about the social issues. That's how he got elected in Massachusetts. He was moderate pro-choice, moderate gay rights. I think he would have had a much better case, and that's what he tried to run as at some point later on. And partly why he started to gain in the last month is when he started moving to the center. That's when his real movement occurred.
Well, really, wasn't that what that first debate was all about? And the ensuing momentum that he got was the fact that he distanced himself from the previous positions he had already given, and he totally threw Obama off because Obama didn't know how to respond to that.
Exactly. Some people would say that he changed his positions, he became that Etch-a-Sketch, that people had talked about. I think Mitt Romney was trying to return to the roots that he had, again, who I think he probably really is. But because he had to drive so far to the right to outflank Michelle Bachmann, Governor Perry, and others, and then he never really nailed down his base. He then picks Paul Ryan to nail down his base. He was unable to move to the center in the way that most candidates do. And I think that hurt him. So I think one of it was the fact that he was captured by the base of his party. Second is that he had always the personality problem, is that people like Obama as a person, don't like his economics. People never really warmed up to Mitt Romney, and he needed to overcome that issue.
Isn't that kind of like the Mike Dukakis
Oh, it's exactly Mike Dukakis. It's also the George Bush, John Kerry issue, is that people loved George Bush as a person, didn't like John Kerry as a person. And that's big because we like to like our presidents. We like to feel like they understand who we are.
Well, how much did the comment the surreptitious videotaping of him talking about the 40% in a disparaging light. How much do you think that hurt him?
I think it hurt him in the sense that it forced him to go on the defensive. And part of what happened with Romney for so long is that he was constantly on the defensive and could never get his message out. He was always having to explain something away. And it wasn't until after that first debate where he could stand, literally next to the president, do a debate, that he could get his message out. And he had that window for a few weeks. But prior to that, it was the 47% gaffe. It was dumb things, for example, which I don't think was that significant, but people glommed on it. Back during the primaries where he bets Rick Perry $10,000. Or when he does, in whichever it was the last debate, where he refers to binders of women.
Yeah.
The thing is, I actually thought that was stupid, in the sense that I suspect what Mitt Romney meant to say is, I have binders full of women's resumes or something like that. And I don't know about you, I misspeak all the time. And I heard that and I said, he left out a couple of words, but I know what he's trying to say. But suddenly people exploded over what...
The social media just took off with that.
Yeah, and I'd have thought this was much to do about nothing. Now, if you wanted to criticize Mitt Romney for a stance on women's issues, that's okay. That's a different story entirely. But to key in on, what clearly struck me as just he forgot to put a word in or something like that.
answer this. Why was Sandy, the storm out east, a bigger October surprise than Benghazi? Why didn't Benghazi have a bigger impact of bringing Obama down?
Well, I think simply because Sandy hit home, Benghazi didn't. You know, Benghazi is somewhere out there, thousands and thousands of miles away, whereas everybody could see Sandy at home, and everybody had a frame of reference of Sandy to Katrina from a few years ago. You know, Katrina under the Bush administration, where FEMA did we have to be honest, a horrible job in terms of handling the hurricane down in New Orleans. And so this was something that was affecting American lives in a big way directly at home. And I think what Sandy did was a couple of things. One is that it really marginalized the Mitt Romney for several days, because the president got to be presidential, got to do what he needed to do, and did a Rose Garden strategy. And what do you do if you're a presidential challenger at this point? There's not much he could do. I mean, he couldn't get his message out again, which we'll talk about. But one of my students said this really well. He said, and it was nice. He said, one of my students said, Mitt Romney is collecting food items, for hurricane victims. He said, that's good, but he said, the president's off trying to, help New Jersey. Mitt Romney's running a bake sale. Yeah. And I know what my student meant to say there is that it was a Republican student that said that. He said that Mitt Romney just looked like he was not there, and he couldn't be. And so the president looked presidential, had leadership. Mitt Romney's marginalized. And then, of course, it doesn't help Mitt Romney when Governor Christie praises Barack Obama for the work that he's doing.
And so you would say then those last two debates, which I think a lot of the political scientists would agree Obama did better than Romney in the last two, that put the brakes on the Romney momentum from the first debate.
Yes.
And then the storm only widened and helped the momentum for Obama shift to the other direction.
Exactly. And that became the October surprise that nobody figured, because it shifted the momentum, and it, more importantly, for about 3 or 4 days, silenced Mitt Romney, because whatever he wanted to say for about 3 or 4 days, what was the big news item? It was which it should be. It was the hurricane.
But last time in 2008, we had no October surprise. Obama was ahead by 7 points all the way through September and October, and it just nothing materialized.
Right.
The Palin nomination as vice president was a little bump, and then it ended up going the other direction.
Right. Yeah.
So we don't necessarily have that. But with Benghazi, is it also a function of the diminishment of foreign policy as being important? I mean, since Vietnam, have we really had an election where foreign policy has been the primary?
Probably the closest might have been the Iranian hostage crisis in 1980.
But we also had the oil crisis.
The oil crisis, right. And clearly 9/11 was, I think, or war on terrorism was somewhat of an issue in 2004 for George Bush. Helping him, right. But for the most part, foreign policy, and especially this year, was a back seat to the economy. That's what people were worried about in terms of it. And again, that was Mitt Romney's strong point. Talk about the economy, talk about his business skills. But again, he never could get that out. But bringing it back to what we were talking about for a couple of minutes ago, one could say that maybe Mitt Romney, because he was forced to move to the right, couldn't run to the center, and that hurt him. Some of the conservatives are going to say that he wasn't conservative enough. But part of the other concern is the sense that the Republicans are facing a real sort of demographic problem at this point. The Republican Party nationwide is older, more male, whiter, more Christian than the Democrats, which are more people of color, younger, female. And frankly, the Republican Party, because of that, is literally dying out. As one generation dies out and is replaced by another, America's changing. And the best example I can give this goes back to Minnesota, is that in my classes, regardless of political party, my students under the age of 30 are overwhelmingly supportive of same-sex marriage. Okay. Overwhelmingly. And the statistics bear this out nationwide. For people under the age of 30, it's about 70 to 75% support same-sex marriage. For those over the age of 65, it's almost the mirror opposite. And if Republicans are going to want to be able to, in the future, recruit young people, they're going to have to take a different approach on this issue. Dick Cheney, former Vice President Cheney, gave I thought a great speech several months ago where he said liberty for all means liberty for all, not just for some. And he said that everybody should be able to entitled to marry the person of their choice. And partly this is a consequence of Dick Cheney's relationship with his daughter, who's lesbian. But he's sort of saying that our party has to move on this issue, and I think that's true. The Republicans are going to have to at some point move on some issues, whether they be immigration, whether they be issues of gay rights, to attract a new generation of Americans coming up.
Okay, so refurbishing the party platform is
right. Correct. Parties need to be changed over time, and I think your point a few minutes ago of saying that are they still fighting the battles from the 1980s? There may be evidence of that.
Okay. Final thing, and then I know you have to go, with the effect you mentioned. Latino vote is being huge, and Romney only captured 27%.
Yeah.
And how does that immigration reform, tie into the economy? And because everything was about the economy, back to James Carville advising the president, it's about the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
And so would that be enough? Because I always hesitate to label anybody a race, but the fact is we did have two races that voted very solidly in bloc, despite maybe any economic circumstances.
We actually had several races. We had Asian American, African American, and Hispanic America voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. Barack Obama lost Caucasian, white Caucasian, but we clearly have an enormous racial divide in terms of voting in the United States. And again, we're looking at a time period, 10, 20, 30 years, probably 30 years before the country becomes not a majority white, but majority non-white. And states like Texas, could very well become competitive swing states in 10 years because of the growth of the Hispanic population. And despite what some people think, that say that people as they get older become more conservative, there's no real evidence that that really happens, or not a lot of evidence. So I just mention that because we are really seeing an enormous change in American politics, a generational shift, because it's becoming much more multicultural. And I think the task for both parties is going to be how to appeal to really a new generations of Americans that are coming up. The Obama election of '08 was the start of that generational shift, as we saw again here. And unless the Republicans get better at figuring out how to talk about issues such as race, immigration, they're going to have a harder time going down the line winning national elections.
Is that part of it, is the imprinting, when young people are forming their values and they vote, and maybe the first 2-3 elections they vote for one particular party, that sets maybe a lifelong pattern of how they vote?
Yep. Few people really do shift over time. Their loyalties will stick. Now, some do, but for the most part, it actually even happens before then. Oftentimes, our party loyalties are determined both by our parents and by our experiences as teenagers. I don't know about you, but my first involvement in politics was when my next door neighbor, when I was 16 years old, was running for the school board. I grew up in New York, and I went knocking on doors saying, "Hi, I'm David, and Tony Sacco is running for school board. Would you vote for him?" And so for a lot of us, it's those early experiences, even before we're allowed to vote. And that's in some sense where I think both parties have to concentrate, is how do they win over the hearts and minds of that age group.
And so you think then, besides immigration reform, then education would be, where that goes is going to also be an important party platform.
Exactly. I think also with soccer moms at this point, every mother that I know, every parent, but especially women, female parent, is very concerned about education, concerned about the quality of schools for their children, and that's something that I think needs to be talked about also for both parties in terms of what can they do for that. And with that, I would say the cost of higher education. We just saw in the last year that there's now more student debt in the United States than there is credit card debt.
Amazing.
It is amazing. And so these are the kind of issues that I think the American public wants both parties to talk about, regardless of party. It's the bread and butter. James Carville got it right. Even if he's not a Democrat. It's the economy, stupid. It's health care. It's education. It's the basic quality of life that I think what most voters want to hear about.
Well, with that, we have to call it a close to this segment, but I'd like to have you back so we can talk about maybe the agenda for the next 4 years.
Perfect. I'd love to do that.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for coming on the show, and thank you, viewers, for your loyalty in watching this show, and I get a lot of comments about how great it is. I hope that you continue with the feedback and that you were as pleased with this segment as I was. And with that, I will call it another month and see you next month on Western Wisconsin Journal. Thank you.